the great catch of fish. Right down here at the bottom, you can see the big net where nobody can, it's made with net all over all those little fish. But it goes all through the stories from the Annunciation, the baptism, I'm done. All the way through, the garden and the crucifixion and the ascension. So it's just a wonderful stole. I usually like to wear it when there's like big children's activities coming, but because today was about the big catch of fish, I thought, well, today is the day. So I can show you my story. So when we learn about the Bible, we start with stories. The garden, Joseph in the many-colored coat, Moses in tablets, Abraham leaving for God only knew where, David, so forth. Our Bibles are great big books with stories that offer us wisdom and guidance for our lives. The stories this morning offer us some of our familiar stories about call. God's call, C-A-L-L, for us to serve God and to be sent into the world on God's behalf. Let me insert a little excuse here. I'm talking a little differently. I just spent a week in North Carolina. It takes a little while for the drawl to go away. So if you don't understand me, I apologize. Isaiah's story is the most familiar choice for the ordination of a priest. Yet an incredibly familiar hymn for all of us is founded on this really amazing vision about God's hymn takes up the whole temple. I mean, imagine being there. I, the Lord of sea and sky, whom shall I send? Here I am, Lord, and it goes on. The gospel, then, is the story about the miraculous catch of fish in Luke. And it's echoed then in Jesus' post-resurrection appearance in Galilee when Peter and his buddies go fishing after the Lord's death and his rising again. But they haven't seen him yet. They just have seen the empty tomb. So they've had a rotten time fishing, and some fellow on the shore says, toss your nets on the other side. I know it's been a rotten day, but on the other side. And lo and behold, it's just like the first time. The nets are full of fish. And this happening impels Peter, who remembers that first time really well. He jumps in the water so he can get to the shore quickly because now he knows that some fellow is the real Lord. Now in 1 Corinthians, Paul is telling his apparently much repeated story of Jesus' appearance to the people to affirm his resurrection. From Jesus called to Peter or Cephas, and then to 500 people, and then to many others through his appearances, and least of all, says Paul, he appeared to me. Paul has a story to share, and we are the evidence today that his stories made a difference. He made a difference by telling stories. Stories about Jesus, stories about the gift of his welcome to all people, stories about how easy it is to accept life in God through Jesus' great love and grace. Through his stories, Paul changed lives, and the church increased geometrically. I've got a little booklet I received from the Diocese of Massachusetts several years ago. I asked for some during the COVID lockdown, and they said, we'll send them, but they never arrived. I wanted to share them with my students in the High Desert School for Ministry. These students are clergy to be in Idaho and Eastern Oregon. And I'll have to contact Massachusetts again to see if they can send some, because they're at a point now where the gal, you can have it too if I ever get them. What a nice phones. Anyway, this booklet is called The Shy Person's Guide to Evangelism. The E word. The key message of that booklet is that we need not be shy. We need to be sharing our stories. We've got so many stories in our lives. We've got church stories, We've got life stories. We have who touches our hearts stories, how God touches our lives stories, stories about how God uses others to touch our lives and those of the folks we've met. So when others touch our lives deeply, we often feel the touch of God in our own hearts. What might that look like in our lives, feeling God through the touch of another? Whenever I ask myself that question, I always think of Toodie. There's a name for you, Toodie. She was my cousin. And her family lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, and she had 3 kids around my age, one older, one younger, but mainly with whom I played as a child. But when I first began teaching orchestra, my first public school job was in Wilmington, the homeland of Toodie. No more vacations. I lived there then, because Wilmington is like 10 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. Toodie taught me how to reach out selflessly to others, not by telling stories, but by being the story. My female cousin Sandy and I were talking in Raleigh, North Carolina this past week about family, and we couldn't help but bring up Toodie. Toodie always offered you food or help, time or love. Whatever you needed, just name it. She gave it. Toodie checked in with me regularly in my first 2 years in Wilmington to make sure I was okay. And when I got sick or when I got stung by a bee and my face swelled all up, she was at my house lickety-split. She basically wrapped me up in bubble wrap and take me to her house to nurse me back to health. Toodie was a faithful Presbyterian, and she did kindnesses like this with all of the zillions of cousins who connected our families. If you were ill or in need, she would drop like a hot potato, whatever she was doing, just to be with you, because you were the most important person. Reaching out to and for others was what made her who she was. When I think of holy women and holy men, I always think of Toodie. She is a story to tell because she taught us all how to be for others and how to be children of Jesus. And the stories we share aren't just in the Bible. Our stories are here today. In the gospel, Jesus helps them all live out a great story of the miraculous catch of fish. And through his ministry, Jesus helps his followers learn how to live out the stories he told, how to touch the hearts of others and welcome them into God's way of life. And then through his stories, he taught them how to catch people with stories. Jesus' followers learned from him how not to be God's shy people. He sent them out with his stories and with his way of life so that they would have their own stories to tell, to share. The Shy Person's Guide to Evangelism invites us into that way of Jesus. We're called to learn stories to share and to live our stories. More importantly, we're called to share the stories of then and now. How do people learn about God? One way is through the actions and the words of others. I ask all of us, what's God like? Why do you go to church? Can I come too? Am I welcome? Is God real? How do you know? How would I know? I mean, the possibilities and questions we could get asked are endless. What are our stories? Because any and all of those questions can be answered through our own stories and through the stories of the scriptures. We're called to share, not to wait for somebody to knock on the door. From the very day of the resurrection, we are called to go and tell. Mary Magdalene was the first. Go and tell, my brothers. Go and tell. We've called to go and tell because we've been sent by God just as much as Isaiah was in his vision after he got that cold, to lighten up, to animate his tongue. We're sent to tell to be and to share God's story of love. Amen.
Yeah.